Thank you for joining us tonight for the USF Lecture Series at ACPL. My name is Anna Calamine. I'm a librarian here in the Reader Services Department here at Maine, and I will be your host for tonight's program. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube video, to our YouTube page. Please hold your comments and questions until the end. The goal for the USF Lecture Series is to present topics of interest and research information to the residents of Allen County and to provide a platform for faculty members at the University of St. Francis to share their passion for their subjects with the library's patrons. So tonight we are going to listen to a lecture, Would You Be a Good Eyewitness? I'm not quite sure if I would be, personally. So tonight, Dr. Mario Baldassari, he is the Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of St. Francis, Fort Wayne. Please welcome Dr. Baldassari.
Thanks. Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm glad that we at least outnumber the staff. That's good. Good local turnout. And hello, everyone online. Maybe we'll talk later. And in fact, if you are seeing this later and you want to get in touch, I have some contact info on this first slide. I'll put it up on my final slide too. I have an email address and I have a Twitter account if you are infected like I am by Twitter. I find it best to introduce myself by way of academic family tree. So what I like to say to students, and I'll extend to you all now, is that as of this very moment, you are now part of this academic family tree because I'm teaching you something. So here we go. I'm down off the bottom of the tree as it's shown on the slide. So there I would be. Just above me is my supervisor who supervised my PhD. His name is Steve Lindsay, works at the University of Victoria in Canada. And so your photo could go right next to mine if you so please. Steve worked with Marcia Johnson at Yale, who worked with a guy named Leo Postman at UC Berkeley, who worked with Gardner Murphy at Columbia. These are just names, more or less, as we head back, because I want to tell you that Murphy worked with James McKean Cattell, who actually worked with Wilhelm Wundt, who is the originator of the lab within psychology. Wundt was the very first research psychologist in the world. Late 1880s, he established a lab at the University of Leipzig in Germany. Cattell also worked with G. Stanley Hall, who worked with William James, who was the establisher of the very first American psychology lab at Harvard. So it's not quite like Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation, but you and Wundt and you and James are not actually all that far apart. And so I show you this to introduce myself, but also because I like to start by saying that psychology is a young science. If you reached into the background, if you put one of these together for biology, it would go back several hundred years. If you put one together for philosophy, it would go thousands of years back. But psychology has really only existed as a research discipline for like 140, 150 years. And so the things I tell you today are things that, yes, are the result of careful, methodical, well put together scientific research, but may not exactly stay true to us for the entire foreseeable future. So the way I see science, particularly social science, is that there's a point out there where the truth is, the capital T truth. And we take a shot at it, and we come closer probably with each new study than we were before. And so we are reaching toward that truth, even if we can't hit it exactly on the nose at every given moment. So we are getting closer, even though sometimes if you read certain reports, it feels like we're kind of scattershotting or moving further and then closer. That can be true, and that, I think, is a good thing. But anyway, it's sort of not exactly a starting caveat, but a starting statement to say that I'm going to tell you things based on what we know right now. These things could change. Also on the side of this family tree is a distant cousin with the best mustache glasses combo on the tree. His name is Hugo Munsterberg. He was actually the first published researcher in psychology and law. So he wrote the first book on some of the stuff I'm going to tell you about today. So the stuff today. The reason we are concerned with whether we might or might not be good eyewitnesses has to do with our concern over crime in general. And it comes from some stats here from the Pew Research Center that they took alternatively from the Bureau of Justice Statistics here on the left and the FBI on the right, that fewer than half of the crimes that occur in the US are reported. That's what we're looking at on the left side here. That number is even lower if you move from violent crimes to property crimes. And of those reported, about half, fewer than half, are cleared, are solved by police. It would be nice if more were reported, and it would be very nice if more of the reported ones were solved. And that's the piece that we're trying to work on here, the solution, when we think about witness quality. So I'll add on top of that the idea and the fact that it can be hard to come by the thing that actually most often results in conviction, most often results in successful clearing of crimes, and that's physical evidence. So this is just an example of a paper published in 1989 in the journal Pediatrics, in which the researchers followed 45 child abuse cases across the entire investigation and found that only 23% of the cases that ended in convictions had physical evidence involved at all. So there's a lot of conviction going on without physical evidence. And that's the situation in which you need an eyewitness in a lot of cases, because that's the next most compelling thing to bring to a jury. But that comes with a problem, and the problem is that what we know of people who've been exonerated, who were originally convicted of one or another crime, almost 3/4 of those involved some false positive witness misidentification at some point in the trial. Somebody accidentally wrongly pointed them out in court, almost 3/4 of the time. And there's also a really high rate of bad forensics in the past. There's also a rate of about 1/4 of these that have shown false confessions. So false confessing seems to be a problem as well. There's also bad information coming from informants. So there's a couple of problems, it seems like, that result in some miscarriage of justice that we've luckily solved in some exonerations since DNA evidence became available. But today we're going to deal with the eyewitness misidentification piece, the biggest one here. We'll talk a little bit about false confession, and then there's 2 pieces actually missing as well. There is interviewing eyewitnesses, which can be more difficult than it sounds, and then there is attempting to remember anything about a crime that you were victimized by. So the roadmap will take us through that. I'll talk about interviews in general. We'll talk about interrogation. We'll talk about this is out of order. We'll talk about victims after that, and then we'll talk about lineups at the end. So, memory in an interview. I'll start by saying that a systematic review of police practice in the US in 2012, based in Florida by a researcher named Ronald Fisher, discovered mostly that standardized interview training is pretty rare among police precincts. So most of the time, police officers are being trained to interview by someone who already does interviews. Here's how I do it. This is how I recommend you do it. They just sort of pass it along that way. Having some class that you go and sit down in and listen to, like police do for many other things, is not as common. In most cases then, interviewers go in to meet with a witness. They sort of greet them. They establish rapport for a couple seconds, and then they say, all right, tell me what happened. And they listen, but then they start interrupting, and they say, what color was the person's shoes? How old were they? How tall were they? And they interrupt the flow of the story that the witness was telling. And sometimes they ask suggestive questions like, it was a green shirt, right? He's about 6 feet tall. He's taller than you, I think. And those kinds of things can really heavily influence a witness. Despite these things, witnesses are generally pretty accurate, reasonably so. We are prone to missing details, particularly when police dig in to try to get real specific, because of course those are the details they need, but that they're often the details hardest to notice, hardest to remember. People also very often remember new things between interviews. So you might interview once, interview again a couple months later, and have remembered something new, but unfortunately that's seen as bad being inconsistent as a witness is seen as being unreliable. That's sort of unfortunate. And lastly, it is very easy to nudge interviewees to fabricate details. And often that happens unintentionally. The police officer will have some knowledge that they think they think the shirt was green. So they'll ask if the shirt was green, right? And of course, a witness is in a very specific social dynamic situation there where they're probably going to say yes. So that can lead to errors further along the way where people can eventually internalize the things that were suggested to them at later interviews. So a witness suggested a green shirt at interview 1 might falsely remember a green shirt at interview 2. So removing those things is our goal, removing some of these issues and keeping the accuracy there. So this same researcher, Fisher, has, with many other folks, developed what we call the cognitive interview. It is essentially psychologists' best practices for taking advantage of what we know is good about human memory and avoiding what we know is a flaw in human memory. It's very well researched, it's well tested, they've worked on it. There's I would say hundreds of papers over the last 25 years. And the cognitive interview as it sits now has 7 key pieces to it. So I'll take you through what those are. Number 1, potentially the most important thing, establish rapport. Get to know the person a little. Tell them a little bit about yourself, the interviewer. Empower them as the expert. Say, look, we're sitting down, we're talking about this event that happened. I wasn't there, you were there. I need to know what you know. You're the person who should be in charge of this conversation. Ask them open-ended questions, hopefully only open-ended questions, and generally try to speak as little as possible. Another idea you can use is to try to reinstate your mental context. So the interviewer would ask the witness to close their eyes and imagine the scene and try to picture what happened all over again and see and sort of take them through the story beat by beat. You could even take them back to the scene, see if that helps. It can also be helpful to encourage multiple retrieval strategies. So what I mean by this is try to remember in different ways. You could do this with some of that same mental context reinstatement by saying like, close your eyes and imagine you are back at the scene, but you're looking at it from a different angle, turned 90 degrees from how you actually were. Think about other details you might be able to see or not see, new things you might be able to notice from that different viewpoint. Or recall the events of the crime in reverse order. Start at the end, take me back to the beginning. This can also be a decent way to identify lying, by the way. If someone's constructed a lie, it can be difficult to reconstruct it back in reverse sometimes, unless they've thought it through really deeply. Try to not ask questions that are leading. Try to not ask questions that are constraining. Don't ask about the green shirt. Don't ask yes or no questions. Ask questions that will lead the witness to talk longer and say whatever they are actually thinking. Tailor your question order to the person. If they're talking about the particular person, but your question list thinks that you should move on to the vehicle, continue to talk about the person until the witness is finished, and then move on to your next set. People often stick really tightly to scripts in these kinds of situations, so encouraging folks to be flexible with their script is a good thing. Tailor your wording to the witness's phrasing. So if the witness has a shorthand they use to refer to something, if they have some kind of acronym they use or a nickname for somebody or something, use those things. Encourage them to remember those things as they're remembering them. Give them the cues that they need to remember the thing as they saw it. Using their own language can help. Number 6, instruct them not to guess, not to make things up. Fairly simple, but it establishes kind of a threshold. You want them to tell you as much as they can remember, but you don't want them to tell you things that they're just kind of guessing at, if you're the interviewer. You want to know what they might possibly remember, but you don't want to just sort of get a bunch of unuseful leads that end up going nowhere for you as a police officer. And the last one that I think is particularly interesting is to try to come up with or allow a witness who's interested in it to come up with nonverbal ways to describe what happened to you. So if they say, well, let me draw the layout of the room. Yes, definitely draw the layout. Have pencil and paper ready so they can draw things. Or if they want to physically reenact something to show you exactly what happened, use that. Any other nonverbal thing that a witness comes up with, absolutely take advantage. Anything that occurs to you, try it, use it. Memory is very verbal in nature, and having language is what helps us organize memory. But there's a whole lot in memory besides language. So being able to access that is a key thought. So, sounds great. If you could do all these things at once, you might be a superhero. And that leads me to the real issue with this, which is that it is hard to train people to do this. It takes a long time, and it's expensive. Expensive to get trainers, expensive to get time and space and train people. So this is part of the reason that, as I mentioned before, this isn't exactly common practice at this point. It's something we in psychology would love to be, but our understanding of how costly it would be to try to make it happen. So it's an example of kind of an endpoint here where we wish this were going on out in the field. We understand why it's not, and we know that it's not yet. We're going to keep pushing. So let's move on. Interview type 2, interviews in which the witness doesn't want to tell you things, either because they committed the crime, so they're not a witness, they're a criminal, or they maybe know the criminal, maybe for some reason you feel the need to interrogate, hence the photo here. So we know two things from the research about interrogation. The first is that the tactics people use in interrogations work. You can get people to talk more about the topic you want. You will get more confessions if you use the tactics we already know about. But there are cases in which, fact number 2, those methods inflate false confessions more quickly than they inflate true confessions. So a lot of the things that are typically used to encourage people to confess will absolutely get them to, but that confession might not be real. And that's a huge issue. Of those in the room, who's watched Making a Murderer on Netflix? A good chunk of folks. So there's you remember Brendan Dassey's interrogation? They put a whole episode into it. It basically plays all the hits. They do all the things that will absolutely encourage somebody to confess. And in Brendan's case, it seems like regardless of whether he actually did the crime. There's a really revealing moment that I still think about from when I first watched it, where he's on the phone with his mom and he's saying, "They keep calling me inconsistent, and I don't know what that means." And it goes back to that piece about that I mentioned earlier, where inconsistency does not mean that someone's untrustworthy. It might just mean they're remembering different things. Or in Brendan's case, he was being badgered to confess, and he was being held up for hours and hours at a time in an office where he was uncomfortable, and he didn't know what was going on. So he decides that it probably means, in the phone call, he says, "I think they just mean that I'm wrong, that I'm saying things that are false." And he's probably right about that is what they mean. But unfortunately, that's not what they should mean. So a particularly recently popular example of the perils of interrogation. I have a slightly more fun example for you, too. Robert Nash and Kim Wade, colleagues of mine, put together a study in 2009, before I was their colleague, in which they attempted to generate false confessions. So the participants in their study did answered a series of trivia questions by betting on how right they were to get one answer or the other, or which was the right answer, basically. So the example on the slide here is the word alligator is derived from which language, and then place a bet on one of the answers. And so folks would place a bet, and then the computer up above them would either show a big green check mark to show they were right, or a big red X to show they were wrong. And if they were right, they were supposed to take the amount they bet out of the little bank over to the side there. And if they got it wrong, they were supposed to take the money from their own personal bank and put it back. So what Nash and Wade did is doctor videos that they took of people doing this task. So they had them answer questions, and then as they were answering, they pulled out a little clip and they switched the computer screen as it was shown in the video from a green check mark to a red X. And so what that looks like is the person taking money from the bank when they shouldn't have, by swapping, by editing the video. And then afterwards, they asked some questions, they accused them of cheating, and they put together 3 different conditions. So in one condition, they just accused people of cheating. They didn't make a video for them. And those folks admitted to cheating falsely about 5% of the time, on average. They told another group, we have video of you cheating, and didn't show them. That group confessed falsely about 10% of the time. And then they showed a third group the doctored video, and that group confessed falsely about 35% of the time. And on top of that, they seemed to internalize the confession. When they asked them about it later, they would say things like, yeah, I didn't think I cheated, but I guess I did. I mean, there's video of me cheating. So you can get people to confess to things they don't remember doing, is the takeaway here. And it's sort of, it's said very wordily on the slide here, but that's the basic idea. If you tell someone you have evidence they cheated or they lied or they committed a crime, then they maybe start to internalize it right away. And if you show them evidence and say, this is evidence you did this, then they are very much more likely to internalize it. So I'm sure you've seen enough shows to know that is a reasonably, and the shows, of course, aren't the real world, but in the real world, there is a lot of presentation of evidence to suspects. Here's the gun. We just watched The Thin Blue Line on campus last night, and there's an interrogation there where the police officer, it's a documentary, and the police officer places the gun on the table and says, pick it up, take a look at it. This is the gun that killed the guy. And they interview the now exonerated man in the movie, and he says, I wasn't going to put my fingerprints on that gun. I did not pick it up. But a different person, about 35% of people maybe, might have picked it up and thought, oh no, maybe I did. And then have been told later your fingerprints are on the gun, and then said, oh no, maybe I did. Maybe I don't remember. It's possible. It's possible to build these kinds of false impressions into people for things that you wouldn't think they would normally build false impressions of. Most of us think, I would never confess to a crime I didn't do. It happens all the time. Some of the reasons it happens are, number one, because suspects of crimes, on average, tend to be disadvantaged in quite a few ways. There's a small list on the slide here. I can talk more about this later, but it's suffice to say that things like poverty, mental health, limited resources can lead to disadvantages that can push somebody to be more likely to falsely confess. But a lot of people confess because they assume the facts will clear them later. Well, I didn't do it, so I'll just say that I did so that I can get out of this horrible 9-hour confession I'm in, and then I'll move on. I'll be cleared later by the facts. But that confession becomes the main fact after that. So that's the problem. Many folks also might believe they'll be convicted regardless, so I better plead guilty, try to get a lower sentence. The police convince people that this is their only way out often. They try to. It's also really hard to establish an alibi, and this is something that I don't think many of us have thought of very much. But if I asked you right now where you were on a Tuesday afternoon 3 or 4 weeks ago, think about whether you could tell me confidently. And think about whether someone else could tell me also that you were there. Someone could corroborate that alibi for you. Maybe. It's actually a study, Strange, Dysart, and Loftus in 2014, who asked undergrads to produce alibis for an afternoon 3 weeks earlier, and then brought them back a week later and asked them for that same alibi over again. You gave us an alibi last week for that one day. Can you tell us it again? And then asked for for some evidence of that alibi. And in that study, half of the students changed their alibi week to week, and half of the students also didn't have any evidence of the alibi. Different halves. So it's not like half did one, half did the other. It's a mixture among. But these are people who are not suffering very many of these disadvantages. They are people whose schedules are fairly regimented. They're people who know where they are on a given Thursday afternoon. They were probably in class or between classes, right? Odds should be good. But even in those cases, they had trouble telling people where they were, establishing alibis. Some people may also falsely confess because they internalize, as we saw in Nash and Wade. And lastly, many people falsely confess because the investigators or the interrogators use techniques that encourage them to accept that the benefits of confessing outweigh the costs of continuing to not confess. So here's an example from a review in a journal called Psychological Science in the Public Interest, in which they listed out interrogation tactics most frequently observed in 182 interrogations, mostly from the mid-90s. So the most common thing they did was appeal to the suspect's self-interest. It's better for you to just confess and move on. They would confront them with existing evidence of guilt, or what they thought was existing evidence of guilt, depending on whether the person was actually guilty. They would try to undermine their suspect's confidence in their denials, identify contradictions in their story, so like they were doing to Brandon, tell him you're being inconsistent. They asked some sort of behavioral analysis questions that they kind of gleaned from psychology. They would appeal to the importance of cooperation. You must cooperate with us. You're here now. You have to deal with us. You have to figure this out together. They'd offer moral justifications, face saving. That's not, we get it. You needed the money. And the person died just as a side. We understand. It's okay. Try to minimize, we call that. They would sometimes confront the suspect with false evidence of guilt, about 30% of the time in this sample. Praise the suspect, flatter the suspect. Great crime. Oh, you did such a good job criming. I can't even believe we caught you, but we did. Appeal to your own expertise as the detective. I found you. I know I'm good at this. I've been doing this 30 years. I know when I see a guilty face and you got a guilty. Those kinds of things. Sorry for the impression. I think I started to become Peter Falk for a half second. They appeal to the suspect's conscience. You should seek forgiveness. You are a good person at the core. I know you are. Please forgive yourself and admit this so we can forgive you. Similar to that, minimalizing the moral seriousness of the offense. So when you group these, we call some of these things explicit leniency. So saying like, if you confess, it'll be easier. You must cooperate. And then another group is minimization. Not that big of a deal. Totally understand. I only caught you because I'm really good. And when you do one or the other of those things, you inflate false confessions and true confessions. But when you do them both together, you drop the rate of true to false confessions from about 7.6, so almost 8 times as many true to false confessions, down to 2, the bottom here. So if you minimize and express leniency, you can inflate your false confessions relative to your true confessions by a factor of almost 4. Not ideal. So, you're a police officer, you have someone who doesn't want to tell you stuff. What do? How can I get accurate information then out of this person? Well, I don't have a perfect answer for you, as you might assume. There are humane, ethical techniques for trying to get accurate information from uncooperative people. The main thrust of all of them is trying to nudge the relationship you have with that person from adversarial to cooperative. Try to build a lot of rapport with the person. And some of that might be some of those same tactics we were talking about. I understand why you did it. I've done bad things too. Like all those kinds of things, self-disclosure is a really big piece of this. Telling them about you can lead to a feeling of good relationship, which can push your relationship from adversarial to cooperative. So in England, they use a protocol they call PEACE. So it has, I won't read, I'll let you read for a second. But I would say the most important piece of that is preparation and planning. going into the interview with lots and lots of information. Truly, in the end, the best method for successful interrogative interviewing is to go in full of real evidence as the investigator and use that to try to assess whether the suspect you have knows about the evidence or not. Show it to them, see whether it sparks memories, see whether it leads them to confess. It's probably the best suggestion we really have. You can also dig back to the cognitive interview and use some of those techniques to try to help them remember better, if they are somewhat cooperative at least. You can get whatever you get from a person, and rather than pressing them to confess, just going out and using that as leads, as if you would if the person wasn't a suspect, if they were just a bystander eyewitness. And I'll finish section 2 here by saying that if you are ever in a situation where you are being interrogated, the best thing we can say from research and real life and advice from police officers is say nothing till your lawyer's there. So let's move to part 3 here. Interviewing, trying to remember things from victims. So this is a less clear area of research. I have less to say about it. I can say that the thing we all think about is stress and fear in this situation, of course. In the one sense, stress and fear activate basic brain systems. We call it your inner brain. It's the stuff that's lower in your head, closer to your spinal cord, that works on our basic functions. Everything from shutting your ears down when you go to sleep so you don't wake up, to remembering stuff, to managing fear, stress, hormone production. So what happens sometimes is if the fear system is activated and chugging hard enough, it can activate what's around it. And one of the things around it is a structure we call the hippocampus, which is the center of memory. It's where memories are stored. It's where memories are controlled, mostly. I'm simplifying, but if you really activate your amygdala, you will activate your hippocampus, and that will improve your memory for the fearful thing. You've probably had that experience. You were scared by something, can't ever forget it. That's due to that closeness they have physically in our heads. And also due to the fact that evolutionarily, you can imagine it would be good to remember things that were scary, right? So we've developed that closeness physically with intention. On the other hand, there is a place at which too much stress or fear can cause us to have lapses in attention or lapses in memory. So there's a line somewhere there, and establishing that line is a case-by-case basis. And establishing how fearful something was is a case-by-case basis. So we have two different things that are following each other, two different variables moving around. So it's impossible to know from the outside as the interviewer. So the best case thing to do here, the best move you have as an interviewer of a victim of a crime, is to trust them. Trust what they tell you. They'll tell you as much as they can. If they have a blackout, then they have a blackout. But you might be able to learn things on either end of it. Add to this that for some people, being the victim of a crime is a really unique moment in their lives. They might only be victimized by crime a couple times. So they might remember them quite clearly. It's much, much easier to remember unique things than it is monotonous things. So contrast that with a person for whom the experience of being victimized by crime is a daily occurrence or a weekly occurrence. They run together over time, so it might be harder to remember the specific details of any one instance. But add on to that if someone is victimized by crime on a constant basis, they're also probably more likely to know who their attacker was. And as we're about to talk about in a second here, if you know who the criminal is, it's much, much easier to identify that person than if you've never seen them before. Makes good sense. The last piece here is PTSD and trying to continue to interview people long after the fact. So one of the things we know about post-traumatic stress is that it can sometimes lead to re-experiencing of an event. Someone who has post-traumatic stress will relive the event over and over in their minds. And as they do this, this act of, and really anytime any of us brings up a memory and tries to kind of relive it or replay it in our kind of mental movie theater, we have a little bit of a chance for it to change. And typically the way it changes is the details become more extreme. They get a little bit intensified. And so if this is someone trying to remember an instance where they were the victim of a crime, that could lead to false details developing over time and stories changing over time. There is also just such high variability in the psychological aftermath of traumatic moments, traumatic life events, that trying to put any kind of ribbon or bow around this particular slide is going to be near impossible. But that's, I can say that it doesn't really seem to depend on the type of crime. It more depends on the intensity of the crime. So it's not the case that, one type of violence, let's say, is more memorable than another or is more likely to result in trauma than another. It has to do with the intensity of each of those types of violence. So higher intensity, more likely to lead to long-term trauma. Okay, part 4 is the long part because it's the part that I do. And it's we're going to talk about lineups. So moving on from the interview stage. In some instances, after the police conduct an interview, they might collect up some faces and show those faces to their witness in a lineup. And this task, I think, feels like it should be easy and intuitive to us. And the reason for that is because we have a decent time recognizing people. You can recognize a known person across even somewhat dramatic changes in experience. There's limits to this, of course. Apparently, as soon as you put on a hat and glasses, you're not Brad Pitt anymore, you're just some guy. Works reasonably well. That's actually a side fact that's not in these slides, is that disguises work. When people change their appearance even slightly, it makes it really hard for other folks to recognize them, especially if they only just barely saw them. So if a good friend of yours showed up in a disguise, you'd probably recognize them. If a family member changed their hair color and shaved their beard, you'd probably recognize them. But if Brad Pitt did, you might. It'd be a little less likely. But if you saw someone walk by you at work and then they walked by you the next day looking completely different, you might think that was a totally different person. So recognizing an unfamiliar person is so difficult, in fact, that you can, as Vicki Bruce found in 1999, look at one photo of a person and a different photo of them at the same time and have trouble matching them together. Her accuracy rates in this task were about 70% among participants. So the task is on the screen here. You would see image A, or rather the image on top, and then you would get this lineup of 10 faces underneath. The task was, which of these is the one on top? And people were wrong about 30% of the time. And a thing that it seems like we should be good at, right? It feels like we recognize faces just fine all the time. And I think that's why lineups are so popular. That's why they feel so compelling. That's why someone sitting in the courtroom going, he did it, pointing, feels so meaningful. But if you get nothing else out of these 45-ish minutes with me, I want you to take away that this is way harder than we think it is, especially for people we've never seen before. So I invite you to imagine. Imagine you're at a fairly fancy event and some dastardly criminal comes by. He steals something from you. Let's say it's a bag, a purse. And he leaves. He vanishes into the night. How brutal. The police might interview you about what happened, and then they might later on ask you to come to the precinct. Say, we think we have the guy. We have a suspect. Put him in a lineup. We want to know if you can identify him from the lineup. So they could show you one of two types of lineups in this situation. The first of those we call a culprit present lineup. The bad guy's in there. So a couple things could happen here. In the ideal scenario, you would pick him. We call that a hit. You got him. Awesome. He's going to jail. How dare he take that bag? There are two other possible outcomes. You could choose somebody else, in which case, in most modern lineups, those aren't other suspects, so nothing really happens. It's as if you had done the third thing, which is reject the lineup, say he's not here. They could, on the other hand, have gone awry in their investigation, found the wrong suspect, show you what we call a culprit absent lineup. And in this case, there is the rejection outcome, where you say he's not here, which would be the correct answer in this case. You could pick somebody else, which would be fine, or you could pick the police's suspect, which would be a very bad situation for that person, this innocent person who ended up in the lineup and then was falsely identified. Because again, this evidence feels really compelling, particularly to juries. So these are those four outcomes. You can have a situation where the witness selects the suspect, and the suspect is the culprit. We call that a hit. I'm telling you this because I'm going to use these words in a minute. You could have a situation where the witness rejects the lineup and the suspect was the culprit. We call that a miss. Oh, darn. Could have gotten him, didn't. You could select the suspect when he's not the culprit. That's a false alarm. That's probably the worst case scenario. The thing we're definitely trying to avoid is falsely imprisoning people. Or you could have a correct rejection, where he's not there and you reject the lineup. So I could propose solutions to this problem to you all day that would reduce false alarms to zero, but they would also reduce hits really strongly, really intensely. We could stop people from choosing. We could challenge them to not choose. We could tell them, be really careful with this. You're putting someone in jail potentially, and that will cause witnesses to be more conservative in their judgments. But then we'd lose a lot of hits. We'd set a lot of guilty people free. So we want to try to find the happy medium. Again, we're looking for a Goldilocks zone. Again, I think I said Goldilocks zone this afternoon in some other context. Sorry. We're looking for a Goldilocks zone, a situation where there is just the right amount of something, just the right amount of hits and the right amount of correct rejections. Quick little bit of history. Lineups were first used in the mid-1800s. There was a magistrate in Middlesex in England who felt like show-ups or court identifications were kind of unfair. The pointing in the courtroom felt unfair to this person. So they established them. And by the way, show-ups, which are what we call lineups with one face in them. So that's like when, hey, we found this guy around the other side of the block. Is this the guy who took your backpack? We call that a show-up. Those are very biased. It's very hard to get accurate information out of those. Lineups are much better in most senses. In that, people pick show-ups more often, and so that means they pick correctly. They also pick falsely. And courtroom IDs are typically coached. Very few witnesses, very few people in general go into court without having spoken with their lawyer beforehand about what they're about to say. So they're not very reliable. They are very good at pointing and feeling it and seeming very in the moment. Like it's the first time they've seen this criminal in years and since the crime, and it's such an important big deal. So in order to try to learn more about lineups, we separate the variables that are interesting in them into two groups. So we call the first group estimator variables. These are things that the system cannot control, but may still be informative for us. So things like, how long did the witness see the criminal? How many seconds were they exposed to them? How light was it at the time? Was it night? Was it day? Were we in the basement? Were the lights down? Were they up? Was the witness sober? Is the identification cross-race? There's a lot of good evidence showing that people have trouble remembering faces of races that aren't their own. That's a whole other hour, that talk. But it's a thing. It's a true thing out there. And you can contrast those with system variables, things that the system can at least sometimes control. Things like how long between the crime and the lineup? How long did you make the person wait? Did you bring them in the next day, or has it been a month, or has it been a year? How you ask them the questions, you have to be as unbiased as possible, give witnesses the option to reject, things like that. How you select the fillers, and so on. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these types, and we'll start with system variables. So the first one is passage of time. If you're a police officer ever, do your lineup as quickly after the crime as you can. And that, of course, has a push and pull to it, right? Because you don't want to do it so quickly that you don't have the right suspect or that you don't have enough evidence. but you want to do it quickly enough that the witness knows and still remembers things. Next thing to think about is the format of the lineup. That's the top right half of the slide here. So most lineups are in the traditional simultaneous format that's in the left-hand side here as I'm pointing. In the 80s, a couple researchers came up with the idea to show faces one at a time sequentially. And that seemed to work at first. We've collected lots of data since then, and it seems like what that just does is reduce choosing. So you lose some false positives, but you lose some hits. There are newer ideas. There's one where people go through and rate each face 1 to 100 on how much it matches the culprit. And if people rate someone as the unique highest rating, there's pretty good evidence that that's probably the person. But if they rate 2 people as 100, they don't know. And you got to count that as a rejection. There's other things like paired comparisons, which is on the far top right here, where you see a bunch of people 2 at a time. And the question is, which of these is more likely to be the criminal? And if you analyze the data and look at who is most often chosen over everybody else, pretty good odds that that's the right person. These more complicated and less heavily researched methods are still in the lab only. We'd like to get them out into the field, but haven't managed to just yet. Presenting your lineup with unbiased instructions is probably the biggest key, maybe the biggest influence psychology has had on practice in any field. Not to overstate, but when police officers learned to stop sitting down witnesses and say, yeah, we got the guy here, which one do you think he is? And like sort of nudging and going, number 2. That was practice, because the idea is, I feel like I'm sort of getting into a place where I'm sounding like I think police are doing a bad job, and I don't think that. What I think is when you get into an investigation, you think you have the right guy, and so you want to get him, and that makes good sense. And so the idea that you would back off of that by presenting something as more objective or trying to put someone in the room who doesn't know what the truth is hard to swallow. So I'm very understanding. I said a sentence there that made me feel like I was misrepresenting myself. But anyway, presenting unbiased instructions is a good thing. Saying the criminal may be here, he may not. Reject the lineup if you see fit is a huge, huge thing. It reduces false positives. It doesn't affect true positives. So it's one of the perfect situation variables. Selecting your fillers fairly is a big deal. The lineup on the bottom right here is a very obvious not fair lineup, particularly if the criminal got punched in the eye during the crime. You can tell who I want you to pick. And this example is based on an injury there. There's other cuts and tattoos and things that can lead to this. And of course, there's examples from decades ago where the lineup has one person who is of the race of the criminal. So it's pretty obvious who the police thought was the criminal in that situation as well. Oh, we'll go ahead and skip that. Meet Dr. Neal Brewer, another researcher I'm going to introduce you to today. Brewer reported several studies where a pair of RAs went out onto campus, research assistants, and one of them would stop a person and say, hey, you want to participate in a study? And if they said, yeah, they'd signal to another person who would step out from behind a tree. You go, hello, and then step back behind the tree. And then they would show the new participant a lineup for the person who just stepped out and back from the tree. So a really simple study to get at some of those estimator variables. And they found very, very surely that having good lighting, being close, and having long exposure duration led to better witnessing, led to more accurate lineup selection. So really easy thing here, ask the witness these questions. How long did you see him? How well lit was it? How long and how far away were you? And if you can ask them, that's fine. If you can actually estimate it based on other evidence, even better, because we don't always remember those things perfectly. So this is kind of an encapsulation of the rest of the variables. It's not really a good time for me to read it out to you, but suffice it to say that the witness themselves also has an effect sort of internally on the situation. Outside of the distance and lighting stuff, how confident they are in their identification is meaningful. How quickly they make their identification gives you some information. Again, whether it's a cross-race identification. There's some evidence that asking people whether they tend to process stimuli globally or locally, sort of a forest for the trees question, can give you some insight into whether they might more accurately identify. Ask if they were sober, ask how stressed they were, try to find out whether they know anything about police processes. So people who know more about police processes tend to be able to kind of back away from a situation and absorb the details that they know they'll need to be asked about later. And then maybe, and we finally get to me here, face memory skill. So Mike Burton was one of the first folks to discover the existence of people we call super recognizers. These are people who can recognize faces from even really short exposures. So in Great Britain, these folks work for the police. They watch CCTV footage looking for criminals, and they find them. It's pretty remarkable. They remember people very, very well. But when psychologists hear about this, when we hear that somebody is awesome at something, we go, ooh, I bet if someone is great at this, there are probably people who are terrible at it, and there's probably a range of interesting other people in between. And so we come out with research like this, where you see the super recognizers in black dots and all the other folks in the sample in unfilled white dots. And so what this says to me is that face memory is a skill. Some of us are good at it, some of us are not good at it, despite what everyone who sits next to me on a plane says. So that's sort of the primary thing of the direction of my own personal research, in which I've sort of put together what I hope to be long-term goals for all of us as we do psychological research on lineups and eyewitness identification. The first thing being that we want to construct our identification tests to maximize the probability that the suspect will be picked if they're the culprit, minimize the probability they'll be picked if they're not the culprit. So flex those system variables. Probably the toughest part of all this, maybe. Another thing we could be doing more of is considering the prior odds that the suspect is the culprit. How much other evidence do you have? That will be considered eventually in court, but considering it before a lineup might helpfully inform your lineup. Supplementing an identification decision with other measures after the fact, so using those estimator variables like face memory skill, confidence, reaction time, all that other good stuff. How far you were, how well lit it was. So witnessing conditions and what we call individual differences, and then the characteristics of the decision. In the interest of time, I was going to show some basics of good lineups based on research. We'll skip past that and just I'll finish up by answering the question I started with. Would you be a good eyewitness? So here's the thing. You came to a talk by a psychologist. So what I'm going to say is, it depends. And I'm sorry that that's the answer, but listen, you came here, you knew it was me. Seriously though, for most important and complicated questions, the answer is it depends, and it should be it depends, if we really truly think about and engage with the question. So here's what I'll say beyond it depends. Most features of being a good eyewitness will be outside your control, if you're ever an eyewitness. How far you were, how well lit it was, how the lineup is presented to you, how you're interviewed, whether the person was the same race as you, how good a face rememberer you are, how stressed you were, and so on. Can't really control any of those things. You might have time to gather yourself, try to focus, try to memorize. You've been at this talk now, so you know what's going to happen after you witness something. So maybe, but it's tough. It's tough to do that without years, at least weeks of training. If you know the criminal, it'll be easy. So sit back and relax. The best thing to do is to be honest with yourself and honest with the police, of course. If you don't know or aren't confident, say so. Because there are social demands of a situation like that, where you're sitting with a police officer who wants to solve a crime, and you want to help them solve the crime. But it's important to keep in mind that it does not help them solve the crime to just agree with them. They want to know the truth. And they want you to tell them the truth. They want to catch, yes, they want to arrest somebody. They want to convict somebody, but they want to arrest and convict the right person. So your job as a witness in that scenario is to do your best to help them do so. And you can sometimes do that by holding back, not saying something that you don't know anything about, not picking somebody if you aren't sure. And probably the most important thing you can do is record your memory of the event as quickly as possible after it. So if you ever witness something, my best advice is to write something down, record yourself talking about it. If you have, most of you have a smartphone in your pocket, you could video yourself real quick saying, I just saw this and this and this and that happened, and I remember these particular details. That's going to be your best memory record of the entire thing. And so then when people ask you questions later, you could either just give them that, or you could watch it to remind yourself. And remember that if you feel doubtful about what you said at the time, that doubt is probably not well-founded. Trust earlier you. I often distrust past Mario, but in this case, he'd be a helpful guy. So I hope that's helpful to take home. I'll take any questions you have. Thanks. There's a microphone down here so that your question goes into the recording. Sure. Okay.
Okay, so you know how in a lot of episodes of Law and Order SVU and the TV shows that sometimes they do a drawing of the criminal. Is there a lot of research between the drawing of the criminal to the selection of the criminal, the potential criminal in a lineup?
There is, and there's a lot of research about the quality of those drawings. So the shortest answer I can give you is that it really highly depends on the artist. So there are some artists that are very good and that can capture those sorts of things, but only when they get an accurate description. And people's descriptions are often wrong. It's possible to not be able to describe somebody, but to maybe be able to recognize them also. So that feeds into a big difference in memory, which is in general, it's easier to recognize something you've seen before and remember it that way than it is to try to generate something. So this is why multiple choice questions on tests feel easier than short answer questions. So a multiple choice question is recognition memory. You just need to recognize the thing you've seen before. But in a short answer question, you got to make it up. You got to produce it yourself. So when you're describing somebody, you are answering a short answer question. And when you're seeing them in a lineup, you're answering a multiple choice question. So in that sense, it's harder to remember a little bit. Add on top of that there's differences in artist quality. Add on top of that having a drawing can really send people in the wrong direction in an investigation if the drawing's a little off, and you've got a thing I would always be a little concerned with. Does that get to your question?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hey. So you mentioned that people who are being interviewed might recall things like after the first interview, right? So like when they come back to it, they might remember another detail later on.
Mm-hmm.
But then also like what's remembered first is often most accurate. And so trust like the past self. If people recall things after the fact, is it likely to be accurate? Like how often is it that things surface in between that haven't just been like shaped or formed over the past couple months since it happened?
It's possible to remember something later on. It's not super likely.
Okay, that's what I would guess.
And it is prone to outside influence for sure, or inside influence.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the story of a study from 1932. It was called The War of the Ghosts. A group of British schoolboys heard a Native American folk tale in which two men go out in canoes and they go out into they find a war and there's ghosts involved, and I don't remember the story very well, but this is sort of the gist of it. And over time, as they asked the boys to remember the story week after week after week, their memory of it changed to conform more to their own society and expectations and knowledge. And so the easiest thing to tell you is that the canoe in the story changed to a paddle boat because they were British schoolboys who had experience with paddle boats. So details like that change over time. So the first recollection will probably be the most useful, the most accurate. But I guess the reason I talk about people sometimes experiencing what we call reminiscence, remembering more things later at a second test, is that I wish that witnesses who changed things were not viewed as wholly unreliable after they changed something. So that's typically what happens in court, is that someone changes their story even slightly and their whole story is thrown out. And I wish that didn't happen. So that's where that second part of that comment comes from.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Are there any identifying features that you would see, if you were to witness a crime, that you would want to look for first? If you do just have a couple short seconds to see somebody, something that you want to try to pick up, obviously height would be one, but anything else that would be a...
The big thing I would look for is if they have any really unique feature about them. So if they have a tattoo you can see, if they have hair that's unique enough that you think it might be worth seeing later, identifiable in some way, except that those things are changeable. So that becomes an issue fairly quickly. What would I look for? So this is a good question, and I'm stumbling to answer it because when we intentionally try to memorize faces, we don't do a very good job. So the absorption of a new face into your memory bank of faces is best done holistically. So meaning looking at the whole face at one time. But what we tend to do when we try to memorize somebody is we look at their nose and their eyes and we do this, we look back and forth, and we think about the features individually. And most of the evidence suggests that that's not how we actually remember faces, unless there is a really distinctive feature. So distinctive features is my best answer to that question. And the next best answer is to not try, to let it wash over you naturally. So cleft chin, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, things like that.
No, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Mario.
Hi.
Hi. So I know you've been thinking of this topic for a long time.
Yes.
Yes, you've been working on it for years, quite a few years.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you feel like you would be a good eyewitness.
I don't think so. No better or worse than another person, because I don't have training in procedures and I don't know enough about exactly how these things work in reality to really confidently say that I could, and I haven't experienced enough of them that I feel like I could relax and be calm enough to think through what I should be doing in a given moment.
I think that's a good point, that if something happens to any of us where we need to be a witness for, or for someone else or for us, I could see how our emotions would really take over for.
So I mentioned that I just watched The Thin Blue Line last night, documentary, and in that night, what happened was police pulled over a car, probably because their lights were off at night, and the driver was a person on probably a spree of crime, who just point blank shot the officer and drove off. And the officer's partner had a memory blackout, couldn't describe what happened, wasn't really sure where she was. They think she might have been in the car, but the protocol should have been that she ran to the car, got on the radio and called for help, but she went to the aid of her partner, which is against protocol, but very natural, especially in a situation like that. So even if you have training and experience, it can be tough to back off our natural reactions in those moments. Yeah. Hi.
Hello. Is there research with trauma and witnessing for like prolonged exposure or EMDR and things like that for victims?
Yes. And my impression of a lot of that work, hypnosis included,
Yeah, that was
is that typically what you see in those situations is a lowering of inhibition or a lowering of willingness to share things in the witness. So you will get more information from somebody once they go through a sort of hypnotic type treatment. But that information might not all be good. So it's the same as, it would be similar to encouraging somebody to tell you everything they think they might even possibly remember. And so you'd get a lot more. And if you just needed something to go investigate, that might be a good way to go, because then you'd have details you could check out and things you could go follow up on as an investigator. But in general, you might get one more real thing and 5 other things that maybe aren't quite right.
Okay.
So there's just like a lot of these questions, the question is where to draw the line for yourself. Like, where's your threshold of what you want to know, or what's worth telling, or what's worth trying to be told. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So I'll say it differently. Imagine you're staring down a long hallway, and I'm down at the other end, and I have a flashlight, and it has a dimmer on it. I flick it on, and you go, yeah, it's on. And I flick it off, and you say, yeah, it's off. You're yelling to me, I guess, in this example. And I turn the dimmer up a little bit, and it's technically on.
Okay.
And you think, yeah, maybe it's on. I can't quite. Maybe I'm just seeing like a squiggly in my own eye or something like that. And you're not sure how to answer. So your question that you're asking yourself is where to draw the line. Do I see enough in here, at the end of this hallway, that I think I see a change in the brightness of the light?
Yeah.
So the metaphor there is the brightness of the light is the strength of the thing in your memory. So if you remember something just barely, is it barely enough to tell someone, especially someone investigating a crime, or would you rather it be a stronger memory before you tell them?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. I papered the room a little bit. Just a little.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. If you have any questions or comments regarding the information shared today, please contact your local branch or email ask@acpl.info for more information. Our final USF lecture for the spring semester will be on April 27, but we'll present a new series of lectures next fall. If you are interested in those programs and our upcoming programs for adult children or teens, please visit our website where you will find a comprehensive listing of events under our events tab. So thank you all so much for coming tonight, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's lecture.
Thanks.